from my faith tradition, I'd like to offer a prayer in Spanish. And so I would like to ask everyone to join me. And there is something very interesting in touch that happens as we connect with our brothers and sisters. So if you're able to touch the person next to you, give them your hand, and acknowledge the sacredness and divinity of the folks that are in the table with you. That's a blessing in itself. Dios, que eres madre y eres padre, te damos gracias. Gracias por permitirnos crear comunidad. Te pedimos sabiduría, paciencia, colectividad, para poder crear la comunidad amorosa, respetuosa y llena de justicia que tú entiendes y deseaste. Te pedimos la fortaleza de caminar juntos y juntas en el proceso de crear un mundo más justo y con más paz. Todo esto pedimos en nombre de tu Hijo, nuestro hermano y compañero Jesús. Amén. Amen. Thank you. So, I was tasked, because I like to call it that, I was tasked to speak a little bit about the rediscovery of nonviolent direct action in our context today, and speak a little bit about Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy and the work that we're lifting up and reclaiming around the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And so I'm honored, and I'd like to express my gratitude to the folks that have organized this conference for the 35th year. That takes a whole lot of dedication and commitment. Some of us forget what happened 2 weeks ago. And it's good to know that there are folks that are remembering and still recomposing our imagination with this type of work. So thank you, Claudia, and thank you to the Interfaith Center folks and everyone else that has done work to make this happen. So I say this often, and so some of you who've heard me speak, you hear that I always rep the South Bronx. Born and raised, and there are many reasons why I gladly rep the South Bronx today, and it has to do with the fact that I grew up not wanting to rep the South Bronx. I'm 38 now, and for a long time I met a lot of people who would often tell me how violent the South Bronx was, and how unworthy to a certain extent it was of being visible. And so I grew up with that understanding. And it wasn't until my mid-teens, when I engaged in doing social justice work, that I understood that those folks that perceived the South Bronx to be that had a very narrow understanding of what violence was. And yes, we had, and we still do, a lot of fried chicken spots. We have a lot of liquor stores, and it so happens that we have liquor stores next to churches, and I sometimes wonder if they play the same role of, pacifying people. We have homelessness, we have displacement, we have high rates of drug addiction. We have all of that, and at the same time we have hundreds and hundreds of families like mine that are raising children, hundreds of youth that are constantly looking for a space to go. We have people in the South Bronx that deserve to be visible. And it wasn't until I reached, again, my mid-teens, and I engaged in the work of organizing around the Puerto Rican independent movement, when I understood that street organizations are created because society fails these young people. That I understood that violence was bigger than just a neighborhood issue. And so if you allow me to share some statistics that kind of give us an idea of the scope of what violence is, I'd appreciate that too. And so we live in a country when more than $17 billion are spent in the separation of immigrant families, deportations, and border patrol and control. Where there are 140 million people living in poverty, despite our being one of the wealthiest countries in the world. 140 million people living in poverty. We often talk about the poverty line, and that poverty line needs to be moved a little bit because our standards of measuring it are not from the standards of people who are experiencing poverty. The US holds the highest incarceration rate in the world. We have more than 3 million people in jail. And so often we forget about detention centers that are filled with immigrants who are called illegal. When in reality, we should think about borders as illegal because they are geopolitical and they make people a lot of money. We live in a country where 13.8 million households face unaffordable water bills, where people drink poison water, where children are being taken out of their households because parents can't afford to pay water bills, where the wealthy and their governments thrive from a war economy and death. In 2017, from the aerial attacks perpetrated by the US military, more than 68% were women and children. More than 68%. We often talk about the cost of war, and we equate that to money, but we don't often think about human cost and how violent it is. The women that in the military are raped and assaulted, and the women whose bodies are battleground for war in the countries abroad. Our communities have also become war zones, where militarized police are fueled by the donations of the Pentagon. How many of you remember Ferguson? I was in Ferguson.
Amen.
And I was in Ferguson being 7 months pregnant. Because I understood that there were pregnant women in Ferguson as well.
Right.
And we were faced with militarized police, tear gases, tanks. So when we talk about war, let us not forget that we are living in a state of war here in the United States of America, and that our police are the military.
Solamente aquí, en Puerto Rico también.
En Puerto Rico también. And I say that to say that when we talk about violence, let's talk about that violence. Because that violence is the one that creates the neighborhood violence that the South Bronx experiences. That countries like Puerto Rico experience. That countries like Palestine experience. We're talking about deep-rooted evils in our society. Forces that make us want to fight back.
Amen.
Retaliate.
That's right.
Because when our people are attacked, there's something in our guts. I have a son, I have a 3-year-old son now, and I can imagine anything happening to that baby or seeing anyone physically assault him in front of me and having the restraint of not doing something. And yet, there's a question that lingers from history. When the state and its systems have a monopoly on violence, what do we do? How do we act? What alternative do we show? Do we engage in the same practice? Dr. Martin Luther King asked us 50 years ago and continues to ask us and will continue to ask us for a long, long time. What do we choose? Chaos or community? What do we choose? Chaos or community? And so I invite us to think about violence in a broader term. Redefine violence from the perspective of the poor, those who experience it daily, not with the definition that is given to us by those who have historically perpetrated violence against the majority of people. I ask us to rethink the concept of nonviolence, because it has deep spiritual and moral foundations, and it also has deep historic political power. A lot of the times in this country, we think about humanism, we think about pacifism, and we also think it from the perspective of those who have dominated the narrative historically. Let's go to yoga class. Self-care. Let's individualize peace. And when we're talking about non-violent direct action, we're talking about a collective action for the collective good.
Amen.
So let's rediscover it. Let's do like the Sankofa birds. Does anybody know what the Sankofa birds do? They look back to what? Move forward. There's a radical legacy. There's a radical history. And as Claude very, very eloquently mentioned earlier, in all our faith traditions of nonviolent direct action. And there's a reason for that. And I'll ask the question again. Chaos or community? Dr. Martin Luther King spoke about the beloved community. And that is a challenge. To talk about love in the midst of chaos and violence is a challenge. Believe me, I work with young people that are filled with energy and want to just shut it down. And that's good. We need to shut it down. The question is, how do we shut it down? For how long? Is this a reaction or this a response? Is this going to interrupt for the minute, or is it going to transform for the long run? And that's the proposal of nonviolent direct action. Dr. Martin Luther King spoke about discipline. It doesn't take a lot of discipline to shut down a highway. I mean, it does. It does. It does. And yet, to engage in fights or provoke or use the type of violence that we're taught by those who have oppressed us, it's a reaction. We react. But to be able to engage in sustained, coordinated, disciplined, organized action takes a lot of strength. I was just talking to Joe. He is also part of the coordinating committee for the Poor People's Campaign. And I am grateful to be working along the side of many folks that are doing this type of work, because it's a back-breaking type of task to organize coordinated, sustained, disciplined, nonviolent, direct action. It's back-breaking because it means that we have to internally struggle and grapple with our differences. We're called to build unity. Not for the now, but for the long haul. We're called to build, and I'm going to use this term, although a lot of folks may not like it, an army of the people.
Amen.
For the people.
That's right.
With the people. On the basis of love in the midst of chaos. We're called to do that. And we're called to do that with little resources. We're called to do that with all the differences that come from our different experiences. You know, whether some celebrate and commemorate on one day and some others don't, whether some have, you know, an understanding around Israel and Palestine and others don't. Some want to talk about ecological devastation being the first point. Some want to talk about war and economy being the last point. We have to engage in conversations and grapple with these differences to build unity. And yet we have one thing in common. Reverend Barber and Reverend Listy O'Harris put forth an organizers meeting, something that I thought was really, really good. Reverend Barber raised, the enemy only needs about 30% of agreements to move forward and attack us. About 30%. And it all has to do with economic interest. Meanwhile, we have about 90% of common interest and agreements, and we focus on the 10% that we disagree on. And to me, that was, I knew it in my gut, but it was also kind of mind-blowing to hear somebody else say it. Because it is true. And it's in the principles of the Poor People's Campaign that I've understood and kind of been reaffirmed in the belief that as a people, we cannot rest any more than we allow them to rest. Because if we allow them to rest, and when I say them, I mean the state and the systems that oppress, they have enough time to figure out what the next move is to attack us. And we cannot allow ourselves to react, because in this country is also historic that the state and its systems not only control the conditions they create, but they also control dissent. Do I need to say that again?
Yes.
In this country, it is historically known that the state and its systems not only control the conditions they create, poverty, homelessness, displacement, lack of access to food, lack of access to housing, lack of access to education. They don't only control that, but they also control our dissent. How we dissent, how we protest. Or do you think it's a coincidence that we, and when I say we, I talk about, my generation, I'm 38. And the millennials, for the most part, folks that have access to social media, are more readily and rapidly seeing the killings of Black and brown youth every day on TV, on social media. Do we think that's a coincidence? That calls for a reaction. And at the same time, we're calling for gun control, but we are investing in militarizing the police. And so we're also criminalizing protesting. All of these things are happening with reason. And so we should be aware of that. So when Dr. Martin Luther King raises the question, chaos or community, we need to step back, analyze our context, and consciously decide to engage in a practice that transforms us internally as a movement and transforms the very fabric of society. I'll say that again. We need to step back and we need to make a conscious decision to choose a method that will transform us as a movement, as a people, and transform the very fabric of society. And that is not utilizing the methods of those who have historically oppressed us. Agape love. Shame them. Move their consciousness. Move their hearts. Because at the end of the day, they too are people. And at the very least, if they are not moved, they will be out-resisted. We can out-weapon them. We cannot out-money them. So let's out-resist them.
Amen.
Let's have the fortitude, the strength, the discipline for organized, coordinated, direct action that promotes nonviolence in the midst of chaos. And I guess for me, I should talk a little bit about the Poor People's Campaign, right?
All right.
So, for the past 2 years, almost 2 years, Reverend William Barber, Reverend Listio Harris, organizers and educators from across the country have been visiting communities throughout the United States. Communities of white people who have been criminalized and who have been incarcerated. Some of them are just recently coming back from Seattle again. Communities of indigenous people who have been struggling for many years to defend sacred land. Communities of people who, like I mentioned earlier, have been drinking poisoned water and who are under an emergency management, very much like Puerto Rico. Communities of young black and brown folks who are supporting themselves and their families on 29 cents an hour. That's the minimum wage, 29 cents. Right? The folks that are fighting for 15 are living with 29 cents an hour. Sometimes we don't kind of think about that. We think about it, oh, $7.15, $7, that's 29 quarters. And so we have been building with the poor and dispossessed. And not in a way of charity, but a way of bringing together and organizing the power and the hope of the poor in this country. Organizing the hope and the power of the poor in this country. Because we understand that although there is a fight in these communities, there is also an insight coming from those communities. And so we started developing and reclaiming what the Poor People's Campaign in 1968 left undone. We've started to study the lessons, not the failures. A lot of people would say, well, the failures, no, the lessons that have been accumulated throughout the years. During the Civil Rights era, after the Civil Rights era, till today. And we understand that 50 years since the Poor People's Campaign originally was launched, the conditions haven't necessarily gotten any better. And we understand that there's been a complacency in this nation. And so organizing the hope and the power of the poor will mean building a new and unsettling force. A new and unsettling force led by the impacted, the dispossessed, the people that have been made invisible in political debates and in the development of political policy. And so we are launching 40 days of nonviolent, moral, fusion, direct action on May 13th, Mother's Day. And for 6 weeks, we will be engaged in nonviolent direct action in 40 states of this country. 40 states. And we are calling in this first phase of the campaign, because this is a multi-year campaign, to the consciousness of those who have been impacted, those who have impacted, and those who have remained complacent. To shift the narrative around the poor and poverty, understanding that those that have created the condition of poverty have conducted a criminal act. Because we speak about, deaths by police, officers, deaths of, folks that have died in car accidents, but rarely do we say that 250,000 people in this country die of hunger every year. 250,000 people die due to poverty. Who's killing them? And so, as the Poor People's Campaign, we have taken on the task, the commitment of continuing the legacy of nonviolent direct action. Again, understanding the deep spiritual and moral commitment, and also understanding its political power to change systemic ills. We have created infrastructures in the different straits. The steering committees, the coordinating committees. And everyone in those committees is engaged in a very important conversation guided by political education. As someone who has been doing community organizing and activism for 25 years, I'd go into political spaces and be told, "You're too religious." And I'd go into religious spaces and be told, "You're too political." Right? So I was kind of like the oddball in spaces, so I kind of had to create my own lane type of thing. That's kind of hip-hop reference, anyway. And so in being able to work in this campaign, not only have I been challenged to rethink a lot of the approaches and methods that we've also learned from the systems of oppression on how we approach struggle and movement building. I and the hundreds of people that are waking up every morning and going to sleep every morning thinking and dreaming and also having nightmares about the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, have engaged in building community internally, which is, I think, one of the hardest things to do, to build a collective concept of what we're doing here. And that in itself is a victory. And I call on everyone that's sitting here, and I'm pretty sure most of you have, to re-engage with the tenets and principles of nonviolent direct action as posted by or put forth by Gandhi and put forth by Martin Luther King and others, Dorothy Day. Mainly because it speaks to it being of personal transformation that moves to a collective transformation and has a social, political, and economic impact. And I didn't mean to make a joke about the whole yoga situation earlier, but I kind of did. Because we are taught that we individually create peace within ourselves, then society will kind of magically become a peaceful society. But in order for impact to really take place, we need to start thinking about how we struggle and grapple together, and understanding that as part of building nonviolent direct action, how do we care for each other? How do we care for the impact that the systems of oppression in this country have for our communities? I have 2 minutes, I could go on and preach for 10 days, but a very important piece of this campaign is finding the intersectionality and interlocking realities of our struggles. For too long, we've been working in isolation, in silos, the faith and the secular. Let's take the public square. As one people, because this campaign and this work is not about Christians or Buddhists or atheists, or is about right and wrong. is about what's human, what's dignified, and what is attacking that humanity and that dignity. And so I want to express my gratitude again, and I want to be disciplined about the time. Thank you everyone for listening and putting up with my yoga jokes. I hope to speak with you all after. Thank you.